Welcome to Hopkins at Home, which provides us, all of us, a beautiful platform to share what we're up to, all the exciting work that we're doing here at Hopkins. I'm Dr. Humaira Ziad, and I'm the Program Director of Islamic Studies at Hopkins. I'm a scholar of Islam and Muslim spiritual traditions, and I'm also a community engaged educator who strongly believes in creating sustainable and impactful relationships between community and students here at Hopkins. And I truly believe that the Academy must meet community needs and honor lived experience. That is the work that that my heart really sings for. I want to introduce some of the work we're doing here in Islamic Studies at Hopkins. And I think you'll find this incredibly impactful and inspirational. And I'd like to share this with as many people as possible and with our many partners in the community. I want to start with talking about why I'm a professor. And really, as a South Asian Muslim woman of color, I have experienced being made invisible in intellectual settings. This has been my reality since I first came to the US at the age of 6. Like so many of us, I experienced multiple forms of discrimination. I experienced Islamophobia, I experienced xenophobia on an almost daily basis, and in many of its gendered forms as well. You know, being a small Asian woman, these are the things that we experience in multiple ways. And after 9/11, I also acutely felt the weight of structural Islamophobia and cultural Islamophobia, and how it put so many young people like myself into these forever defensive postures. So we were too busy needing to represent to survive, rather than engaging and exploring and feeling immense joy in the beautiful spiritual and ethnic and religious identities that we brought to the table. I know through personal experience that academia can often be an unsafe space for students with intersectional identities, with marginalized identities. Students of color who belong to many different groups can often feel that the intellectual setting that they are in is in fact railing against them, that they are not able to represent who they are in the most fulfilling of ways. And so there is often no recourse for those students who are hurt, who are discriminated against in academic settings, who feel like their voices are shut down. All of these challenging experiences that I've had in my own intellectual life have driven my vision to create educational spaces that honor the many, many identities that students bring into the classroom. And Islamic Studies at Hopkins, in fact, serves a very unique set of students. Our classes are actually made up of between 75 to 90% students of color, between 30 and 50% students who identify as Muslim or who come from Muslim families, and a significant number of first gen and limited income students as well in our classrooms. My goal then with this unique and beautiful group of students is to create a classroom that is a vessel for empathy and a vessel for action. So I support students, and it's not just me, with my multiple partners, with my friends, with my co-conspirators, I support students in creating relationships of empathy with one another and with the world around them. And I train them in critical thinking and action around structural injustice. It is on this twin foundation that we are establishing Hopkins as a leading site for scholarship, teaching, and action and public engagement in Islamic studies. We have a track record now of creating many publicly and socially engaged projects that bridge the campus and community. And we engage the arts, we engage social justice, we engage public health, and we. So let me introduce you to a few of these projects, and then we'll launch right into the project that I know we're all ready to sink our teeth into, which is 99 Clay Vessels. So currently we are partnering with the Interfaith Youth Corps and an advocacy organization, American Muslim Health Professionals, in guiding 20 students to support COVID vaccine awareness and access in Muslim communities around the country, which has been an incredibly successful project. I am currently wrapping up a community engaged course that I am working on with the Center for Social Concern at Hopkins. And this course is on 9/11. It's been co-created and co-taught with the social justice organization, Justice for Muslims Collective, and its executive director, Darakhshan Raja, in which our students actually learn how 9/11 and the war on terror has impacted communities of color, and they learn how to organize against this impact. And they're creating oral histories of organizers in DC, Maryland, and Virginia that will support the work of social justice organizations going forward. And finally, and this is a project that we are diving into today, we are co-creating and supporting 99 Clay Vessels, the Muslim Women Storytelling Project, a multimedia arts and storytelling project that centers the stories of Muslim women activists and provides a healing space for women on the front lines of social change in Muslim communities. Please introduce yourself, introduce your artistic vision, tell us more about this project and why we're doing it together.
Okay, thank you for that enthusiastic introduction. And thank you so much to Hopkins at Home for hosting this conversation. And thank you so much to the program in Islamic Studies at Johns Hopkins University for fiscally sponsoring this project and giving it a home and giving it a place to really grow. And yeah, okay, so who am I? I am Allison Kaisea. I have been a social justice educator for over 20 years. I got a bachelor's degree in race, class, and gender studies from Penn State and became deeply committed to teaching as a tool of liberation and freedom. And so I started teaching in a residential residential therapy program for girls ages 14 to 18 who had been taken away from their families because of severe abuse. I taught feminist studies there, which they desperately needed. I then went on to teach English as a foreign language to immigrants, moved to Yemen for a year, which is where I was over September 11th, 2001, came back to the US, got a master's degree in history, taught at Northern Virginia Community College for 8 years. I taught US history, world history, and Islamic Civ. And then started working with these awesome folks in DC, Teaching for Change, an education project in rethinking schools, where I started working on radical social justice pedagogy and learning how to really experiment more with teaching, anti-bias teaching strategies. And then I ended up in Baltimore with you, where the two of us were working in an independent interfaith, academic interfaith organization. And that is where these vessels were born. So yes, you and I were working in this interfaith organization that had for 30 years been creating opportunities for dialogue between white Jews and Christians predominantly. And then they had decided that they wanted to include Muslims in that project. They hired the two of us. We did not know each other at that time. That was our first fateful meeting. Interestingly, Homera and I, as she said, are extremely good friends. We share a birthday. And the day that I was hired at that position was actually our birthday. So the whole thing, you know, has such a deeply cosmic, you know, foundational story. So I started working there. Homera and I deeply connected because, you know, she is a scholar of Islam and is so profoundly, you know, learned. And every time I talk to her about anything having to do with our religion, I just learn more and more. And I've been friends with her for so many years now. You know, she's a really potent force. Not only, you know, in your sort of content knowledge, but, you know, your lack of judgment and your just real passion for like connecting people to the tradition in ways that, you know, is empowering. And I, of course, grassroots educator, always want to, make sure we're talking about like what's going on in society that's not okay. Because at the core of my faith and my commitment to God is social justice. If there are people suffering in the world, we must do something about it. It's a requirement to call ourselves believers. This is what I believe. So we got into this organization with loads of idealism, and we're deflated really quickly by a board and an executive director that wanted us to live up to their assumptions and expectations about what they thought Muslims should be. And we pushed back against that. No, we expect to represent ourselves, and we want to really share why these assumptions are not okay. And we were severely retaliated against because of that, in deeply racist and Islamophobic ways and misogynistic ways. And so clay has long been a form of therapy for me. And I would come home just distraught about the situation at work and just started to sculpt these vessels. And it became a really important form of worship. It became a vicar for me, a ritual form of remembrance to help me stay centered in a time when I was really being shaken at my core. And I wanted to let my lesser self out of her cage. And so this was really about, frankly, the culmination of all of our spiritual development, I would hope, right? Is that when we are under all of this pressure, who are we going to be? And how are we going to hold true to that and not allow people to, push us into that space of our lower selves? So this was really like a very liberatory practice for me during this difficult time. And that's how they were born.
And I think this is really a moment where we were both deeply questioning things that we had held dear, principles that we thought would be upheld especially in a context of talking about faith, talking about religion, getting together with groups of people who wanted to heal the world through a progressive vision of how our religious communities can impact each other in ways that forward social justice, and to see that becoming so deeply tainted by the unwillingness to name the deep power dynamics at work, to name racism, to name Islamophobia, to name anti-Semitism, to name these ways in which our communities hurt one another, even in the context of so-called dialogue, was a deep learning experience. I think that set us on a different kind of trajectory, at least for me, in thinking about, well, how do we both open our hearts in deep empathic understanding to one another, while being fundamentally aware of structural injustice, because that too is a way. Empathy can only come through a deep understanding of structural injustice. It doesn't exist outside of or next to. It has to come from that understanding, because only then, when we can see how we are structurally impacting one another in deeply wounding ways, can we then break that space open between our hearts and say, there it is. We know how we are hurting one another, and we acknowledge it and name it. And now we come together as real humans, face to face, naming everything we've done to each other. That to me, and taking that into the classroom for me, has been my mission moving forward. But for you, it's been your art. I mean, you have really opened up your artistic practice, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that artistic vision.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I, both equally were transformed out of this experience. And let me just say a couple things, if I could, just to kind of, complete the story of this project and what it's doing. And then I think I would love to talk about our artistic vision because it's far beyond this one project, right? And so I really want the two of us to have a opportunity to talk about that and why this like art scholarship partnership is so powerful. You know, art scholarship community partnership is such an important part of our vision in what you and I want to create moving forward too. So anyway, I made these pots. I fired them in a special way so that you could see the fire marks to really both represent the cosmos and our ability to transform. And I basically, you know, they were sitting on a shelf. COVID happened. I had a dream about using these in like a community vicar of the 99 names of God, you know, which is why I used the name 99. But that got thwarted because of COVID. They were sitting on a shelf and literally started talking to me one day and said, you know, we should not be just sitting here. We should be doing what we did for you, which is holding you through this difficult experience. And also thinking about the fact that the 20th anniversary of 9/11 was coming up, which just happened in 2021, and thinking about all of the stories of trauma in the 9/11 era that never get remembered, you know, and that this story that what you and I went through was part of that. It was part of the fallout of 9/11, right? Because where did the people we were working with get those assumptions that they could not break free from, right? It came out of, you know, 2 decades of misalignment. So started to talk to you. You know, I got into conversation with you and said, this is what the pot said to me. And, you know, we started thinking about how other women could unload these stories that they were holding onto, these stories of trauma. And of course, as an artist, it was really important to me that I want to get women in a space where they're actually creating something and remembering that like we have the ability to change stories and about things that happen to us. And I don't mean just like making up something else. I mean, really digging deep in a spiritual way into something very painful and trying to figure out like how you can live with what happened in a way that is empowering rather than disempowering. Because for so many of us, these traumas sit on us, you know, for decades. I mean, for some people, you know, literally hundreds of years. It's in our blood, it's in our ancestry. So just trying to find ways for women to do that. We got in touch with Dr. Sabrina Njai, who is a psychotherapist and healer in Baltimore, amazing woman who does these storytelling workshops all over the world. She would be with us today if it weren't for the fact that she is abroad doing workshops right now as we speak. And so we are bringing women in from all over the United States, Muslim women, into these storytelling workshops, 11 women at a time. We do some deep talking, contemplation, and then every woman creates a story. And it's all, you know, going on the 99 Clay Vessels website. So people can go on there now and see what some of those stories are. And maybe you want to jump in now and talk about the poetry piece, because of course, what's also beautiful about this project is that it just keeps growing. And every time we have a conversation about it, something else emerges. And what is emerging are all of these different healing resources. So these pots for me were a healing resource. Conceptually, it's a vessel to hold 99 other Muslim women, you know, in a place to just process some stuff they need to process. They're all creating art, right? And then you also, the first time I talked to you, you immediately had this awesome idea. So why don't you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah. So the first time you reached out to me about this project, the very first thing that came to my mind, I mean, outside of all of the, you know, we walked through everything, we you know, we came out with this beautiful storytelling idea. But what really jumped out at me was well, wow, we're looking at clay, we're looking at vessels, we're looking at shaping and transformation and firing and all the different ways in which elements interact with the clay to create these beautiful things. And for me, the first thing that came to mind was spiritual transformation. It was the ways in which that whole process of moving from clay to something absolutely beautiful is a process of that involves all the elements. It involves pain. It involves the water, fire, earth, air, and immediately it took me to poetry. And why it took me to poetry is because poetry is an art in Muslim civilization that has often been used to express that depth of spiritual transformation. It is a and the process, and this is of course what I study too, right? I study Islamic spirituality. I study the way in which the soul, which is considered the breath of God inside a human being, is transformed over the course of a lifetime is brought into emerges as that breath of God, emerges as something that shines out of a human body and illuminates the world with its with that breath of God that it carries within. And it's a process of firing. It's a process of spiritual transformation. And so here I'm thinking, okay, well, now I want to bring in poetry, because there's been so much poetry around clay and vessels and transformation that. And for me, this is a way, when I connected back to my students, when I connect back to the way I teach, that poetry really opens up both the historical and spiritual for my students. It's been such an important way in which Muslims have expressed spiritual longing, have questioned religious identity, have questioned binaries, have made political waves. It has been, the art par excellence, and it brings to life the complexity of Muslim practice and the richness of Muslim reflection on spirituality, on theology and identity, which honestly we have lost in so many of our contemporary renderings, especially in diaspora communities, of what it means to be Muslim. And so poetry really offers the dynamic nature of what it means to be religious. And one of the things that I am always talking about in the classroom, because I know my students walk in not just to intellectually learn, not just to take information in, they walk in with deep spiritual longings. And I mean that across the board. And I don't even necessarily mean it religiously per se, because a lot of my students walk in with no religious identity. They walk in just wanting to know themselves. They really do. Nobody walks into a class on religious studies. I mean, that's just not been my experience over the last 20 years without having some potent, deep, spiritual question about who they are, some existential question, which it is my duty to unearth at the same time as I offer them the intellectual scaffolding to make sense of it themselves. And so identity is it's not this unchanging thing. It's an emergence. It's a movement of the heart. It requires patience. It requires a set of values. It requires love to nurture and to unveil. And poetry for me best expresses that movement. So on the one hand, we are offering this set. What we're doing for this project is really curating 99 poems from different parts of the world, from different time periods, from different geographies, that touch on these themes of transformation, that pull together clay, water, earth, fire, air, to really think about spiritual transformation in meaningful ways. And then part of this will be to then move this forward into workshops around poetry, thinking about how do we use poetry as learners to effect that kind of transformation, and use the poetry from Islamic civilization that I see that many of us have lost access to, that many of us don't consider to be a part of a legitimate expression of religious identity. And to bring that back, how do we understand spiritual and religious identity as a poetic and artistic commitment? And this is particularly true for all communities that have experienced any form of dehumanization or criminalization of their identities. And so when we look, for example, at Muslim communities, many other communities of color in the United States, especially during the period of post 9/11 and the war on terror, when we have seen the rise of civil rights abuses and the rise of criminalization and dehumanization across the board of our communities. What happens when our young people are coming up being asked to perform their religion under intense scrutiny, both from within their communities, asked to present this unchanging, static, hegemonic view of Islam, and from outside, where they're being asked to perform a particular idea of a good Muslim, a Muslim who cannot critique the state, a Muslim who is always ready to oblige, by naming themselves as sort of anti-terrorism, as anti-this, anti-that. No, this is your religious identity, and your spiritual identity is not an absolute. There are no binaries here, and our goal here is to offer all students and all people who want to learn the opportunity of saying, my spiritual identity is always in emergence, and it is not going to be something that can be controlled from outside and or from within my own community. I have ownership over it, and poetry is going to be my way to enter a new way of thinking about spiritual identities. So this is my deep commitment to that, to outside of this, everything. I adore this project. It has really changed my life as an educator and as a human being. But the poetry piece for me, poetry has always been a way that I have connected and questioned and been brought into deep communion with my own spiritual self.
Yeah, and this poetry collection is it's just awesome. It's gonna, when it's completed, it'll just be its own little reader, but it's also connected to the other stuff going on in the project. And as you said, like, we can then use those poems to generate all kinds of workshops. So it's a healing resource, but it's also a learning tool, which I love, because part of what happens with this, this criminalization and dehumanization of Muslims post 9/11, is that it corrupts people so badly from even being able to see anything beautiful about our tradition. And part of what Islamophobia does, and I think for you and I, like, that's the part that hurts the most. Like, this is sacred to us, and to see this desecrated so much, over 20 years is deeply, deeply, deeply painful. And so part of this project is also doing some of that healing work. There's no magic wand, in terms of healing. And of course, like, none of this justifies like what has been done to our communities over the last 20 years. And yet fostering these kinds of deep human connection is healing. It is unquestionably healing. And we have seen that in these workshops. And one other note I want to make about the workshop that you brought up, thinking about students and identity, what's happening in this workshop is we have created a radically inclusive space where women can really come with anything that they need to talk about. And part of that is talking about bigotry from other Muslims, and so making sure that this conversation, understanding the multifaceted nature of Islamophobia, and that we cannot, just make these nice and neat categorizations of different kinds of bigotry and discrimination that we experience. It's really all part of the same problem. And so that's so important.
Right. We have people talking about spiritual abuse within their own communities. We have people talking about gendered forms and racial forms of discrimination within their communities. And I think what you're really emphasizing is that of course that folks are coming into these workshops, bringing in these stories that are so multifaceted, but have been and often are forms of abuse from within their own communities, which have been exacerbated by that hard gaze of Islamophobia. So that communities are in so many ways feel like they must present this unified stance of what Islam is or what it means to be Muslim, which erases the complexity of practice and identity, and often impacts women in so many different ways. where then we're not able to bring up issues that actually need redressing, whether they're issues of racial, gender, ethnic, sexual discrimination within our own communities. We're afraid, or we're made to feel afraid of bringing those up for fear of that whole question of airing dirty laundry, right?
Right.
Because if you say something about gender discrimination within Muslim communities, then what will other people say? You'll just be
Fueling the fire of
right,
bigotry.
fueling the fire of Islamophobia. Exactly. And so then where does that, yes, those are the stories that are coming out in these workshops.
It's true, and that's right. Like we're a no to that categorization, right? Like we all get liberated, together. And it's working beautifully. I mean, I think both of us were, these were so many like research questions. I mean, thinking about this from a scholarly perspective, part of this is also a research project for the two of us. Like what works, what resonates, what do people want, and how do we just foster what you said about students just wanting to know themselves. That was such a potent quote, because that's exactly what I think you and I, in partnership are really interested in, is just creating a multitude of spaces where we can get to know ourselves, which, for us is the sort of like root desire of our religion and being in religious community, is that we want places to do that kind of work. And yet the places that exist and the experiences we've been through, have left all kinds of residue that get in the way of having a really authentic relationship with God. And so I think part of, what you and I are doing, is really experimenting with that and seeing what works. And so far, these storytelling workshops have been just unbelievable in their like power, deeply loving spaces, people sharing incredible stories, and not just traumatic. I think when people hear Islamophobia also, they're immediately like, I don't want to talk about like things that, aren't flowery and happy. I'm sorry, these things are happening in society and they're extremely serious. But also many of the women in this project, that's not where they're going. They're going to their source power. They're going to the things in their life that help them when they, in the same way that I went to the clay, they're showing us what they go to, writing poetry, writing letters to loved ones, painting. And so.
Well, I actually think that's exactly, when you say as a research project, that's exactly what we're discovering. And that's exactly where we're taking this, is where do Muslims actually go to seek that connection? It's a question. It is a research question, and it's a research question that we're entering into creatively. A part of, we're actually creating space where people can create those moments of deep communion with one another and with themselves. And it's a question, because we often tend, I think in many religious communities, which is why I think we're seeing that move away from religious communities or formal religious communities, is that there's this understanding that there's a certain way that this communion must happen. There's a certain way in which you must connect with your soul, your community, your God, your gods. Or there are certain prescribed ways. And of course there are. I'm a scholar of religion. We know that there's prescribed ways, but those prescribed ways have always been in flux too. And there's been prescription, and then there's actually been what people did with that. And what we are really trying to think about here is creating these spaces which can launch us into deeper explorations of what is it actually, how do Muslims in the United States, imagine religious practice for themselves? What kinds of creative ways are people using to engage rituals, to engage religious texts, to engage religious histories, to engage genealogies? What are the different ways in which people are expressing this and finding meaning? Because for me, finding meaning, and for you, finding meaning is essential. How are people actually finding meaning within these? And I think both of us as as a community engaged educators, we like to do this in a setting where we can actually see it practiced, where we can actually let people, people just let go and show us how they're doing it, not just talk about it, but show us. And eventually they'll also talk about it, because we're seeing this as larger research projects, both where we are both, talking to people, interviewing people, getting people's insights, but then creating these spaces in which we actually see how these creative religious expressions come to life. And that too, again, is I guess for myself as a scholar, but also as someone who's keenly interested in I guess what I would call more chaplaincy work, spiritual work. What is it that I've always walked that line is, we are researching, but we are also in that space creating opportunities for people to become whole and heal again.
Mm-mm. Yeah, I think that's part of like our partnership, works so well in that way, because you're interesting, because I've been in academia for many years, and you're very interesting. I think this is important and relevant for people who are interested to know, like, what is the program in Islamic studies all about, and what do you bring to it that's really special and different maybe from other programs in other universities. And so, you clearly have the canon. I mean, you are Yale educated, you work at Johns Hopkins University, you have an incredible resume of scholarly achievements and experiences. And yet, you really get this artistic practice of experimentation, in so many academic places. And this is where, like, the academic study of religion that I can be quite rebellious against, as you know, because there's no heart in it, right? It's served to you as this sort of like canon that you have to absorb in different ways, coming from, academia versus like the scholarly, Muslim scholars, religious scholars, I mean to say. And so I love that. I love that about your program. And I think that it's so important for students to have that opportunity to really be able to see these like texts and traditions and how they play out, in communities, and how people talk about them or don't. Right. I mean, there's also so much stuff that happens in academia that seems so important. And when you get out into the community, you're like, nobody cares about this. Nobody even talks about it. And yet it gives students a really skewed understanding of who Muslims are, which then affects the way that they interact with us, right? So in that respect, I think you're giving students such a sophisticated way of understanding this connection between scholarship, experimentation, community, diversity. Yeah. Yes. I was wondering if anybody has any questions before. I mean, I would love to kind of launch into like what this project says about our bigger vision, but I'd also just feel like we hit people with a lot of information.
Allison, there are actually a few questions about your artistic practice, which is something I'd really wanted to get into as well. So one of the questions that we have here is the pictures on the website are really beautiful. And so we want to talk about that a bit. So when making a vessel, what guides you and how do you discover what it wants to be?
Oh, beautiful. That's a beautiful question.
And tell me if you wanted me to start moving the slides.
Well, so yeah, let's do that.
Let's do that.
First, I'm going to stop talking because I just want you to be able to absorb the pictures, and then we can come back and we'll answer that question. So why don't you just very slowly, go through these and let everybody just take a look for a second.
You can nod when you want me to move forward. I want to make sure people are getting everything.
think there's one more. Yeah, you can just leave it there. Okay, how do I choose? This was the first conceptual project I've ever done. Before that, pottery, I was a functional potter. I started functional pottery because I love cooking, love feeding people. Homera can tell you, when you come to my house, I'm all about, really worshiping the God within. Frankly, it's one of the reasons I started to do functional pottery, because I love cooking as just, a way to show my love for people. And I thought it would be really cool to make the dishes that I serve them on. And so I was really just in this sort of meditative practice for 10 years before I did this. And so this was my experimentation. I picked this firing method because my longtime teacher, Hadrian Mendoza, did a pit fire with me. It's a special firing process. I just lit up after I did this. I was so excited by just watching what happened in this fire. So that's how I picked the firing method. I experimented with a couple other firing methods. I mean, that's what art's all about, is just being willing to experiment, see where it goes, and keep going from there. I made pinch pots for this, again, because it wasn't part of my identity as a potter. I was very much a committed wheel thrower at that time. I didn't do hand building. I didn't do sculpture. And so this was my way of also just trying something new, that idea of transformation. Don't do the same thing over and over again. And all of that is really critical to my art practice, overall. So I don't know if that answered your question. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. What other questions were in the chat?
What have you discovered that you didn't know when you started the project? That's something for both of us, but if you have something that you want to share now.
I think that, as I said, this was my first conceptual project. And so this whole thing is an inquiry into, who am I as an artist? I didn't identify as an artist before this project. And so, that's the journey that I'm on. What this project has really gotten me clear about is, first of all, how much pain people are holding, and just desperately need a place to put it. And it's actually not that hard to create these, even though we've done a ton of work, right? But it's not complicated. Creating a space where people can really be heard. We're not trying to fix them. We're not trying to give them ideas about how to do something. Just listen to people, and hold them. Wow. It's so powerful. And so this concept of the vessel, I think this is where this project has gotten me real clear that I'm a vessel maker. I make these functional pots, as I said, as part of my own worship and meditation, but I make these conceptual vessels like this project that I want people to be able to step away from your busy life and have time to do that deep contemplation work. And that is the gift, that has always been at the heart of my art practice, and has me very inspired, to do that moving forward.
And I've been thinking a lot about, as I always have, about third spaces, about how we create communal spaces for a different kind of spiritual reflection, and how we have, there are so many. This has become a something that the Muslim community in the US has started experimenting with in so many ways, is how do we step outside of the ways in which we have been taught to create community, which really aren't actually creating community, but are rather creating certain, pushing forward certain hegemonic discourses that stand for community, but in the end usually support a certain kind of power structure, a more authoritarian structure, and are pushing aside and shutting down and silencing so many of the creative ways in which a lot of Muslims, young and old, are are imagining their relationship with themselves, with their families, with their neighborhoods, with God, and how do we actually bring together all the different parts of ourselves into alignment through in our spiritual practice, which fundamentally to me is what spiritual practice is. It is bringing all our parts into alignment. And I've found that I don't think I knew that, I think we knew that this need existed. I don't think we saw it with such power as we have in these workshops. It's like when we reach out, it's just, people respond in ways that are so, it's like they were waiting their whole lives for this, and
so many of them have actually said, like, I can't believe I just got this invitation because I need this right now. Exactly. I mean, it's really become like something we keep hearing over and over again.
Yes. Yes. And to have these especially to have creative women's spaces, I think for me, it's just reiterated a lot of that as well, is how important it is for us to also be in community as women. Even though that is and of course there are many women's spaces in religious traditions, but how do we make those, how do we draw on the power of that sisterhood to create something outside the box, because that is where the energy lies right now. And frankly, for me, this experience has been personally so meaningful. I think that participating in these workshops over the space, of the last, what has it been now? 6 months more? I don't know. It feels like
June right? Was our first workshop.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I mean, to me, I've of course I've always been a believer in the way that participating in art opens up our being in ways that we could not possibly have imagined but I've seen that it's been a personally spiritually transformative movement for me. So being involved as a scholar and as a participant in this has moved my life in directions I never imagined, and has opened up ways. And that is the power of art, and why I want to keep bringing that into our scholarly practice.
Yes, and we can talk more about that. Although, are there any other questions that we want to address before we talk about that?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and talk about that a little bit, and then I'll check.
Okay. So yeah, thinking about where this is all going, Homera and I want to keep experimenting, and we want to keep doing this kind of research. And, for her, thinking about how do we give students the richest, most critical, diverse experience in their time in the program. And for me, I want to now, so I'm working on a body of work, that is more political in nature, looking at the war on terror and, the damage that has been done through that. So that's one body of work that I'm working on that I'm very excited about, and is a really important part of my practice. But there's this other piece where I really want to explore more, like what you said about third spaces. How do we worship when the institutions and the authorities that exist right now do not resonate with us? It's not even in a place of judgment. It just doesn't resonate, and we want to have a place to do that work. And so, but I want to do that in conversation with you as a scholar. I want to do that in conversation with students and community members, and do that experimentation, like throw out an idea. Here's something that's really interesting to me. Now let's play around with, like, how do we create this space where we can get present to the conversation that we want to have? how do we get our hands involved? How do we shift our consciousness so that we're really open to this experience? All of this takes so much time and experimentation. And, I would love to be able to do that work, continue doing that work with you at Hopkins with your students. And we have so many different ideas about how to do that already, right? I don't know how much detail we want to give, but do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, part of what we have been thinking about is actually having a kind of an artistic fellowship that's connected to the program itself. So what does it mean to have somebody who is an artist, who is experimenting with these ideas connected to the program for a year, with the ability and the resources to do this kind of practical work, to create in collaboration with scholars, to experiment in collaboration with students, to take those artistic projects that are connected to how we experience the sacred, how we experience, which are creating even new forms of ritual practice, to supplement what folks are already engaged in, and experiment with them in community. Really take those and take them out into our community, into Baltimore, into our neighborhoods, and really see how folks respond to and connect to these kinds of ritual practices, as well as getting a sense of what it is that people do on their own. Part of that will be, and in the process of taking these artistic projects out into the community, we will start learning. People will start sharing what it is that they do to make meaning in their lives as Muslims. And that will just start expanding the repertoire again of what it means to be Muslim, what it means to express that kind of spiritual identity there's a couple of projects I know that you're already involved in, Allison, that I don't know if you want to share a little bit about. I think we have a few more minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see which one. So I guess if I, if we were going to launch the next project, I would do the Jamarat, which we've already started talking about. So these are, for anybody that doesn't know, if you go on Hajj to, Mecca in Saudi Arabia, there's a pilgrimage there once a year. All Muslims are supposed to go unless, you can't afford it. If you can afford it, you're supposed to go.
Once in your lifetime.
Once in your lifetime, at least. So so you go to Mecca, and there are many, many, many rituals over a number of days. And one of the rituals is the Jamarat. There are these 3 pillars, and you have to go collect some stones and throw the stones at the pillar. And this represents stoning the devil. And so I'm really fascinated by this ritual for many, many reasons. But just to kind of keep it simple, my idea is like, what would it mean to kind of reenact this ritual from like actually building, the bricks, to building the pillar, to then like hitting this thing and thinking about the devil. The devil, it's such a juicy word. Like everybody has a reaction to it, like an immediate reaction, and stuff starts happening, and wow. And then like all this heat comes out. So and if you look at the ritual, people are pelting this thing with such force. It's actually one of the most dangerous parts of the Hajj, because I think people get overtaken with these things in their life that cause them such pain, and this is a ritual of really trying to just like to get it out, push it away. So there's that top level, right? But then what happens if we kind of go down to the next level, like move past the emotional reaction, and then just start thinking about like, well, what is this devil in our religious tradition? It's such a potent force. And there's so much that's been written. So again, thinking about the scholarship, well, what do Islamic traditions say about the devil? There's so much to learn just in that one question, and of course, like from many different perspectives, as you said, like bringing in poetry, bringing in, different kinds of art forms, but also bringing in textual traditions and looking at the Quran and looking at these foundational texts.
and also tongue-in-cheek texts, right? And also ways in which the devil has been rehabilitated in multiple ways, and also the humorous ways in which the devil shows up in, as all the trickster figures. And I mean, there's so much that we can do with that particular symbol, and how it's been viewed and subverted over the course of human history.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, just all these different perspectives on the devil that we didn't think about. How does that open us up? But then again, going in deeper level of spiritual understanding of yourself. And this is Islamic. There are inner meanings and outer meanings of traditions, of all traditions. So going deeper down, where is the devil? I am the devil, right? The devil lives in all of us just as much as God lives in all of us. So that first layer reaction, trying to just reject. But what happens when we do that deeper contemplation work and we think about the devil within us and how we kind of resolve that spiritually? And I think, like, in terms of my own spiritual self-awareness, it's part of like really understanding that and not rejecting it. It's like trying to reject one side of your hand. You can't slice your hand in half. And so having these opportunities to just do this deeper work, even just in like very, relaxed conversations that I have with people floating this idea, and people just want to start talking about it right away, so I'm excited.
And your goal is that we're not just talking about, these are not just theological conversations, right? These are we're actually creating ways in which people can engage with these ideas in an embodied way, which is what religious traditions have always done, which has been both the theological and the embodied. And so how do we recreate these embodied experiences? How are we actually getting folks to reconsider, reassess, relearn these aspects of our tradition, the many diverse ways in which we've addressed these issues, which have now presented to us like, either this or that. No, it wasn't just this or that. It was a spectrum of ways, even to think about the devil, right? How do we reclaim that in a deeply embodied way by recreating this ritual practice of the stoning of the devil? And in that embodied action, we are beginning to reconsider and bringing in all of these different ways that the devil's been constituted in the tradition, to think about the depth and richness that is available to us as spiritual beings.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I mean, just going back to, the students in your department and thinking about like what they can get from this. I think, again, what's really special about what you're doing is you're not just thinking about taking care of your students intellectually, and empowering them intellectually, but making sure you're also thinking about like their heart and soul and physical life and how all of that is affected by their time in the program. And yeah, I absolutely want to help them get out of their head and into their body and thinking about their soul. And, in that way, it's awesome collaboration.
Well, we're coming on to time. I think we just have a minute left. So I just wanted to thank you again for being my partner in crime and being my
in art, not in crime.
In all ways. And to thank Hopkins at Home for creating this opportunity for us to talk. Thank you to Will Quinn for being such a support through this process. And I've really, really appreciated having this conversation and being with all of you today. Thank you all for coming and being with us. And we look forward to having you participate in everything we do moving forward.
Yes. Thank you.